And we will call the meeting to order.
Mom's
and
yelling
I will
at the
ask
TV
Dawn,
again. They don't
I'm
hear
sure
you,
you'll be
Mom.
reminding us to lead us in the pledge.
Flag's in the back.
Flag is in the back.
I'm still reading.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Thank you, Dawn. Keeping us honest here on
Sorry.
time. And, welcome. It's nice to have a couple people joining us. Thank you, Ari Tan, for joining us. We have been at the budget planning process since November. And I'm sure Roger and Mark and the principals and others have been at it since we wrapped up last year. So what you'll get to see tonight and that Roger and Mark will share with us tonight is what we think may be the final draft presentation that's going to incorporate those assumptions that we began speaking about in November and the information that has evolved and where we stand now and what we anticipate of expenses, investments, and what we know of revenues in a very dynamic environment right now, statewide, with respect to a provision of Act 46 called the allowable growth limit and some information and some misinformation that has been, some of what has guided our work to make certain that we not exceed those limits, but it is looking a little bit more lately like a moving target, although we do expect there to be a vote tomorrow. So I know Roger is going to do his best, along with Mark, to share with us what we know, the parts we control. Our budget has been built based on what our student needs are and in honoring our taxpayers, but it's in line with the strategic plan and the investments being made to meet outcomes for kids. That's been the context of all of our conversations as we've evolved over the last few months, and this is the culmination of that. But it's also our opportunity to continue to probe and ask, and yours as well, as we will, at the next meeting, likely be taking a vote on what we will put forward to the voters. Yeah. With that, thank you, Mark and Roger. This is
Our
a lot of
pleasure.
work.
Yeah. So thanks for attending, and for those at home, nice to have you here, and of course, as always, the board. I like this arrangement, don't you? This setup here.
You're so fancy.
I'm so proud of myself. But I just wanted to start by acknowledging the hard work on the part of a number of people, obviously including the school board, but especially our Chief Financial Officer, Roger George, who I think has done an amazing job of keeping his eyes on the moving target, if you will, and Kim alluded to that. I think that the legislature has been challenged with a big deficit they're facing in the new legislation passed in the last session, Act 46, has really thrown some interesting things their way, and some collateral issues have come out of that. Not a lack of strong leadership and their best in trying to understand the landscape, but in fact, Kim is correct. It's been pretty confusing over the last couple of weeks, even since when we last met last Monday night, given the misinformation that the field has received, and that really points to business managers and Roger's colleagues across the state who have done their best to come forward with real transparent and real information to help inform boards, and that has been a challenge. Our story tonight, I think, is a favorable one, if in fact the estimates that we have tonight end up being true, but at this point, it's our best information that we have tonight on the 18th of January. So we have more data for you tonight that you haven't seen before in terms of some of the formulaic data that's helped us make some decisions on tonight's presentation. And I'm going to leave that large lifting for Roger, who I think is going to be quite capable of explaining in some detail, depending on how deep the board wants to go in terms of all of these moving parts and what does it mean. So we wanted to start the presentation with some slides that you've seen before, but for the benefit of the audience and those at home, starting with some planning assumptions, which we brought these forward back in November of 2015. Kimberly, thanks. We'll run through these pretty quickly. Whenever we put together a budget, it's important that we check our assumptions around what we can expect this new year to hold for us. And as you can see, starting with budget number one, we did have some offsetting revenues coming in from our carry forward, the fund balance, that we knew was going to be an asset, knowing that it was going to help us hopefully stay under that imposed cap. So that was a really important resource that we were able to carry forward. We knew that the state-based homestead tax rate was going to increase, which it did. We felt, at least initially, that we may need some transition funds to help with the merger. In fact, there were no dollars built into that because we feel we have procured the necessary transition grants through the AOE to make that merger work successfully. So we didn't put any money in. We didn't need to. We hope that that's going to be okay. You can see here the last bullet has to do with all of what we've been talking about the last couple of months around the caps through Act 46. And that's what we'll talk a little bit more tonight about what that means today on the 18th of January. Thanks, Kimberly. Our wages and benefits were set because we had negotiated successfully labor agreements with both teachers union and support staff, so those were costs that we were aware of. In fact, 4 teachers took a board incentive to retire. We were hoping for 5, but we're very happy for the 4 in their decision, and that certainly helps the budget for next year. You're going to talk tonight about the capital reserve, and our assumption was back in November that was going to be an important part of the warning, and in fact, you've spent some time discussing that as a board. And again, I mean, is that, again?
It looks like the same one.
Looks like the same one. So never mind, number 4.
Number 4.
It was so important we said. Said it twice.
We felt we needed to reduce the technology budget. We did, and we brought almost $5,000 back. You saw that as a reinvestment because of the way the budget was planning out. We felt we could bring that $5,000 back, which is in keeping with our 5-year technology plan. Special education was a huge driver of cost this year, and you've seen those data as well. We did add a half-time position that's in next year's budget, which will help address some of the evaluation needs in the district. Summer Learning Camp has been, at this point, it's not in the budget. Title I cannot sponsor, which is a federal program, cannot sponsor it next year. And I didn't feel that FY17, in light of where we were, was able to absorb that cost. So at least at this point, Summer Learning Camp for kids who are, when you think about that rating scale of 1, 2, 3, 4, they're right below the 3 mark, so not quite at the standard, and we're going to suspend that for a summer. Transportation costs, our assumption was they were going to increase, and they have, based on the contract going up per our contract. And also we added a 16th bus to the fleet this year. This was a big hit for health insurance. Nearly 8% of our health insurance is going up, and that's caused a lot of the problems with Act 46 in terms of trying to absorb those costs without going over the cap. And lastly, Kimberly, thanks. As always, our budget reflects a world-class education, the ends policy of the district, and blended with the current local economic issues that Act 46 especially has challenged us by this year. So always thinking about what's best for kids, as Kim has said, and the next couple slides following this, you'll see that has been our focus. Our class sizes, we'll share that data again tonight, are pushing maximum allowable under the guidelines of the board. We've always, at least since I've been in Essex Town, we've always been at maximum allowable. The board made a decision to maintain 8 K teachers next year, which at least for kindergarten keeps those numbers at a more optimal level of 16 to 17 kids per class. We'll show you those data tonight again. We have curriculum requirements, and although I think we have an adequate resource in our operational budget, it doesn't come close to, I think, resourcing classrooms to the degree they need to be over the next few years, given the new state standards, especially in the area of science, which requires a lot more hands-on material. And finally, very, very happy about our universal preschool. We're early adopters in Act 62 and now Act 166. Our preschool population has grown exponentially, and with that comes an expense to fund those, but we're also happy to report that it typically, and I think this year is tax impact neutral because it does increase our average daily membership. So we're serving lots of kids and lots of families, and that's really exciting work. Two more slides before we turn it over to Roger. As always, again, for the benefit of the audience, this really is sort of the structure in our school district and what drives our work and what drives the development of the budget. The blueprint is our strategic plan, which identifies the targets we want to address around student learning and effective teaching over the next 3 years. And the constellation of systems around that blueprint reflect all of those integral parts to the work that we do. So first and foremost, when we put together a budget, we look at what we're striving for kids and how to resource these systems to make sure that they all work in concert with one another. Finally, Kimberly, thank you, is what we vet our ideas through these lenses of your policies as it relates to student outcomes, always looking at student performance data, making sure that we're just not aimlessly shooting in the dark, but we look at real kids, real time, real needs, and we invest accordingly. Our special ed service plan, again, special ed is probably 22% of our overall budget in that neighborhood, so it's a big driver for cost, but it's also, again, based on the needs that kids have, so it's a needs-based service plan. Local policies, class size guidelines, again, are looked at. Effective schools research. We have coaches in place, which reflects the research in our country today that the best professional development is the development that's happening in the classroom. So the board has hired coaches, I have, but through your investments have hired coaches over the last couple of years. Again, strategic planning targets, I've mentioned a host of federal and state laws that pretty much drive the work that we do as leaders and you do as boards. You have to pay attention to that. And finally, the labor agreements that we have, a really important policy document in itself, which will be up for discussion 90 days after next Tuesday as we think about merging our two labor agreements. So again, a very brief summary.
No, just kidding.
Brief summary of the work that goes into it. Roger's going to talk about the numbers, which really what we're here tonight, but the story about how that's developed, I think is important for the audience to understand that it's not just putting numbers in columns, it's really about kids and their learning. Good. I'll pass them out to the audience. Thanks.
Thanks. And if you have enough, I can.
Roger, you want to take care of it? Color copy and sign.
Oh, okay.
Good evening, everyone.
Evening,
Actually,
Roger.
how I'm going to get tonight started is to remind you after our intro slide that says we're talking about budget and revenue and capital reserve. We look again at our budget numbers. This is the same total budget as we discussed last week, which is a 4.3% increase. Now I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Mark Andrews, who's going to talk to you a little bit about class sizes.
Well, that was lackluster. That's all you can do. Again, these are data. These are tables that you've seen before, but I'll just give those in the audience a chance to study those. We have a series of tables for your consideration and review, starting with the enrollment that we look at all the way back to FY11. And shows you the number of students per school and the district enrollment and the number of teachers that we've hired. These are classroom teachers. It doesn't include all the specialists, but you can see we've been fairly static. So unlike our sister districts across the state of Vermont, we have we don't have a drastically changing student enrollment as evidenced by the number of kids in our schoolhouses and the number of kids in our classrooms. So our average class sizes, you can see in the last bar, that's the class size average.
I could just add to our, looking at that page, I left in the FY16 estimate, the number of kids we estimated a year ago at this time for this current school year to see that we were close, but understated, especially at the elementary level, and thus one additional teacher at the kindergarten level. So rather than 15 classroom teachers as planned this year, we do have 60 classroom teachers and plan to continue at that number next year.
Thanks. You can see that we've juxtaposed the AOE quality school standards, which are somewhat different. than what we have currently in the town but these are the new guidelines that the State Board agreed to, I believe, 2 years ago. So on the top, you can see our grade level clusters, and what we have currently in your class guidelines are what's considered minimum average, optimal average, and maximum average, in terms of what's best that you believe is important. The AOE quality school standards, again, slightly different. They've clustered grades, kindergarten through, our guidelines, kindergartens remain separate. AOEs, they cluster K through 3. And they've also gone to a 4 through 12 cluster, which, again, is a far leap from what your guidelines are currently. So we just wanted to show, again, to remind the board that what we have is different than what the AOE is suggesting. So at Essex Elementary School, if you can remember those numbers, in kindergarten 16 was optimal, and we're at 16.9. And then if you can see on grades 1 and 2 last year and grades 1 and 2 this year what the class sizes are. And I believe K 1 through 3 maximum was 20, Roger, I believe, in the previous slide. So we're right under what you consider to be maximum. Founders Memorial School.
Mark,
Yes.
sorry, I could do this math in my head. I'm sorry, I should just do it that way. We added to that 8th kindergarten teacher room. What were our numbers? I can do the 126 divided by 7.
So can we go back to the last slide, Kimberly, please?
So we made that decision to add that teacher in.
Or not to reduce it.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was.
I definitely remember it to be
It was
18 point
18.
something,
It
because
was-
we're like, okay,
It was
going to be
It was
over.
19 kids.
It was,
Yeah.
yeah, it was approaching 19 kids.
So we didn't add it, right, it's just we kept.
We didn't
Yeah.
reduce.
We did.
as
So
we
we're
originally expected.
remaining 20, we have 22 teachers there next year.
Right.
Thanks, Dan. Yep, so likewise, at Founders, 2 years ago, we had 20 teachers, we dropped to 18. Last year, we brought 1 teacher back this year to 19, and we're gonna maintain 19 next year as well. We've put parenthetically, who's gonna move where, but that's still a moving target, we're not sure. You can see in grade 5 at Founders next year projected is a higher class size than what the 4 or 5 multi-age is. So it's only January, and there'll probably be some changes there. We also had a retirement here for Founders Memorial School, and so that throws things into a direction that we have some other choices and some other options. So you can see here the class size of nearly 23 students in grade 5 it's a larger number than that I'm comfortable with, but it's within your guidelines. Okay. EMS, again, you can see the numbers, they have always been this way, lower than, in some cases, class sizes at Founders. One of the phenomena that occurs is that because there are looping classrooms, we don't like to break up those loops. So you just can't move kids around because they're with teachers for 2 consecutive years at Essex Middle School. And we don't want to disrupt that arrangement. So our class sizes are looking good for next year for 16-17. Again, no changes that we've made in terms of numbers of teachers. And we do plan on maintaining the grade 6-8 alternative program that serves kids with exceptional needs. That'll be in place next year as well. So no real changes from what you saw last month. Now I'm going to turn it back over to my Roger.
Thank you, sir. This next slide has changed a little bit since last week. Rather than just looking at the second draft, I've tried to incorporate info from the original budget also. So we indicate our largest savings is about $66,000 from the net savings from 4 teachers retiring. We discussed last week some savings on finance administration salary allotments for next year. The new positions and other additions to the budget have not changed since our review of that information last week. So the $100,000 plus reductions offset, of course, much of the increases that are shown, so that the new items total is a rather modest $34,000. Again, that's for initiatives and staff not included in the current budget. We certainly have increases in expense for existing staff members and benefits. The most specific example of a increase, as the superintendent said, was the health insurance. By the way, we assumed, because Visbit told us that they were asking for a 7.9% rate increase, that was in our budget planning assumptions in November, and just a week or two we got confirmation that that increase has been approved at that very limit. So our budget for health insurance will be adequate. Next page breaks down our school budget in the various functional areas as the state
I think we're off. I
calls.
think we're off sequence, Roger.
Yep.
Oh, can you go ahead one? No? No?
No.
There.
There it is.
Again, the functional comparison, listing the various areas of our budget. As I indicated last week, generally our largest changes are seen in regular education and special education, where most of our staff and student services are located. The last line, the transfer to the capital reserve fund, the voters have approved a reserve the past 2 years as a separate proposition of $125,000. So that's shown as actually being included in the past two budgets. It's not shown in the proposed budget. The board decides in their final deliberation to or ask voters to approve a separate resolution again this year. That would be an additional item. In total, the budget is up $935,000, 4.3%. The next one I have is comparison of proposed budget to prior years. I think back one more.
Back to.
Yes. So this gives a look back to fiscal year 2011, where our budget was decreased about $582,000 in our district's response to the state at that time asking districts statewide to try to bring in lower budgets. We responded favorably to their call, which was called Challenges for Change. You see how the budget has changed each year since then. A very modest increase in FY12, and then beginning FY13, the inclusion of the separate item for the capital reserve. Our proposed budget tonight, as already mentioned, the second last item there from the right, a 4.3% increase. The next item all the way to the right, if we've discussed a possible reserve resolution, of $125,000, that would raise the budget percent change from 4.3% to 4.9%. Again, I draw your attention to the bottom bar there also, that in our previous 6 fiscal years, FY11 through FY16, our school district budget increases have averaged 2.1%.
Roger, I think we get to this when we get to the per pupil spending, because that will be how the budget will need to be presented this year, correct?
Yes.
And while our K-8 numbers have remained stable, I think I recall our numbers were pretty close to, our estimate is pretty close to spot on what our actual was this year. With our, counting our pre-K kids, we've actually had an increase in enrollment?
Yes,
Counting our
yes,
fractional pre-K kids, okay. And I imagine that
Yeah,
plays
no,
out in the
that-
numbers when we get to
Yes,
per
yes.
pupil spending.
I wonder if, Kim, we want, at this point, before we keep, going through slides, if, because the board has seen this information now 3 times, wonder if we want to pause and just ask the audience if there's any questions you have that, now that we've presented the first 8 or 9 slides before we go on.
The revenue part is especially confusing, so. This is the part, the investment part, I find far more interesting, easier to follow. But yes, so board members or community members? Looks like Dan's got one.
Yeah, the
brewing.
one, cost drivers, the 200, I'm estimating 260, 270,000 in health insurance increases.
About that, yeah.
On this slide, the one that lists it all, that fits into that regular education, that's part of that piece, because that's for the teachers.
Yes.
Okay. So
Not
that-
excluded. yeah.
That roughly $900,000,
Yes.
adding those two together, includes the 260 or 70.
Dan, a more complete answer to your question is the state requires that we show salaries and benefits across each of these functional lines, which does make our budgeting, our budgeting more cumbersome, our reporting more involved, and so forth. So no, the health insurance increase isn't just in regular education, it's in each of those lines.
Okay, so.
Depending
But it's
on-
part of the bottom line.
Oh, it's certainly
Sort of
part of the
okay.
bottom line, but not.
Okay, so but
Yeah.
like, okay, so there's a portion of that 270 falls under library, because library includes a
Correct.
couple of staff.
Yep,
Okay, I
yep.
understand.
Yep, no,
It's all split up into,
yep,
all right.
yes, so, but obviously, yeah, with library, actually, there's 6 staff members budgeted in library, 3 or 4 people in guidance and so forth, so the bulk of it is in regular education
But
and
there are
special
pieces of it.
education, but pieces throughout, yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Roger.
Anyone else? Is it seeming
Do you like the
familiar,
colors,
Diane?
though?
You shouldn't talk too much about the color, seeing that they got
I know, I was
just
gonna say,
black and white. I'm sorry.
Just one question, and I apologize, I'm sure you guys spoke of it last week when I wasn't able to be here, but the decision for now to suspend that summer program, that cost differential and/or that return on investment in terms of what it was doing for kids, how substantial a setback is that? Are there other anticipated ways to make that up for kids when they return in the fall? What do you have in mind there?
Well, I don't know if I can tell you anecdote. It's been only 2 years that we've run the program, so there's no longitudinal data to show that what we have been doing is having the effect. We've just started to take that data. We also know that kids who enroll, there's a percentage who don't attend. We also have been working with the Y and Rec and Park about coming up with other options for kids in the summer that are accessible for more parents. The cost of the summer program is not exorbitant. I was hoping that we'd be able to pull it off with title dollars. I'm still not convinced that we can't figure this out, but for tonight's presentation, I just didn't feel it was I could put it in there, Roger. I would guess that we're probably in the mid-20s range to run the entire program. Thereabouts.
More like about mid-30s.
Mid-30s, when you, personnel, the personnel are licensed teachers, we pay them at their per diem rate that they're contracted for during the school year. So it's not an inexpensive program considering the number of kids that we serve.
Yes. Salaries, busing expense, and a small amount for supplies for the summer program.
So would this be the first year you're not going to run that program?
It would be the first, we've run it for 2 straight years. This would be the first year we're not running it. Yeah. There's still, again, there's a meeting with the director of curriculum tomorrow to look at other ways to try to run it by looking at what we've currently budgeted, and is there another way to address, to run it, but not not through this.
Program and
Yeah.
transportation and.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
But we don't have the data that would support my claim that it's making the difference for kids coming back to school the next. I know it is, but there's no empirical way of determining that.
Actually,
But I'm encouraged to hear that you're continuing to
Yeah.
strategize backfilling
Mm-hmm.
the value it provided. to kids.
Students with disabilities who are entitled to an IEP called Extended Summer Year, Extended School Year, SESY, those students will be served.
Right. And these were, just for the sake of those who weren't with us for these previous conversations, the students who did not qualify otherwise for special ed services, but were that group that we sought to capture that were almost there, that could benefit from, hoping to prevent the slide, but it's a relatively newer strategy employed to reach that same end, and I'm encouraged to hear you guys are trying to think of other ways that, in the absence of a summer program.
Yeah, I mean, one way to do it is,
do
and
it.
what we'll talk about tomorrow, is do we serve fewer kids who we have who are more tangled up than, before it was just who all wanted to come, and I think that if we refine our criterion to identify that, the kids who are in greater need, that is probably another way we could address it.
We reduce the cost by serving fewer.
Yeah, I mean, we had teachers who were signed up. Teachers are very enthusiastic, and the first week of school, we assign kids per teacher. And one teacher might have, I'm not making this up, 3 kids in his classroom, and a teacher down the hall had, 19. So there's no way of, because mom and dad make decisions to do other things other than summer school, so it's hard to predict.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
If nothing else?
Yep. Moving along to
Revenue.
how we plan to pay for the budget we're presenting. Go ahead, one. Yes, well, actually, the one previous. We'll first look at this revenue summary. The total of the proposed budget, again, the budget without any provision for capital reserve, is shown at the bottom right-hand side of the page, $22,679,716. The planned revenue must equal the proposed budget. The next slide that we'll look at in a minute shows the breakdown within each of these major categories line by line, but you'll see that in terms of local revenue from the FY16 proposed budget to the proposed budget for FY17, just a very modest increase of $5,600 in local revenue fund balance. That was included in our discussion of assumptions at the beginning, that our fund balance, money remaining in the budget and excess revenue from FY15 was up $227,000 compared to the year before. Our state revenue reimbursement for special education and transportation expenses, the information that we've been given from the state shows an increase there of $295,000. And then in terms of federal grants, money for the IDEA program and the title grants is down in the coming year about $68,000. All those 4 lines above the term that's labeled offsetting revenue, that in total is an increase of $459,000 from this year. The balance of our school budget then comes to us from the state education fund. And so our draw from the state education fund would be going up next year $476,600. The state education fund ultimately will look at in more detail, but the number of pupils that we have is in consideration for that in terms of both per pupil spending and our tax rate. The next page then is the revenue detail. Again, looking at budgeted revenue the past 2 years and the proposed revenue budget in the coming year. Won't get into the line-by-line issues with that unless there are questions. My next slide.
Is the reserve fund reflected at all in FY15, FY16 on that last slide that we just glanced at briefly?
Yes, the reserve fund is the money for that, if the voters approve the reserve fund, our state education fund draw goes up by that amount of
Okay.
money.
Okay, so the big.
That's the revenue change
So
that would,
So in FY15, the 16,850,000, that included
correct.
okay.
The base budget without anticipating approval for the capital reserve, the money from the state would have been 16,725,162.
Okay, and so that 17,839, if you do a reserve, will go up by
Yes.
whatever we do
Yes.
reserve.
Correct.
Okay.
Good. Next, I think our overhead projection is in line with our paper copies. Hopefully for at least a few pages running now. Tax rates. This is the same information that the board saw last week on tax rates. That was known to be accurate till late Thursday night or early Friday morning or something like that, so I'll get into that with a little more detail. But for those looking at this the first time, the blue shaded line shows the percent change in Essex Town's tax rate in each of the years from FY11. The blended tax rate, both our K-8 district and the unified high school taxes, when blended together, the increased averaged 2.3% for that 6-year period. The budget that the board has been looking at would have resulted, as shown in the second last column on the right, 0.75% decrease in the Essex Town rate, which would have been a savings of $7.50 per $100,000 of assessed value. Even increasing that budget to add in the capital reserve, there still would have been a modest percentage change in the tax rate, a 7/100ths decrease, and which would have been 70 cents per thousand.
100,000.
Or 100,000, yes. And also shown in those last two columns are the changes in the how the blended rate would go with the high school, and the total change per $100,000 with high school estimates figured in, and the total taxes per $100,000 of assessed value. So if you're with me to that point, let's now look at the next slide. This gets into the issues that we've been dealing with the last couple days. The information shown for FY16 with reserve is the exact same information, actual information that you saw on the previous page. And then the middle two columns, FY17 proposed budget as of January 11th, with a gross spending amount per pupil. We'll get into that a little bit further in a minute. Shows the same rates with the high school also factored in. Now with changes that the state discussed with schools on Friday for figuring in a somewhat different fashion our spending cap per pupil, the amount, take our total education fund amount and divide that by our equalized pupils, that's the spending per pupil. They would now include some exclusions in that per pupil amount. So what we thought to be a 0.75% decrease in taxes, if I'm understanding correctly what I'm calculating, because the state hasn't sent anything in writing yet or exact numbers, but I believe that I've done the math correctly. Our tax rate, rather than going down 0.75%, would go down 1.8% for the base budget without capital reserve. And so taxes per $100,000 of assessed value, rather than going down $7.50, they'd go down $17.80. You might ask, where is the high school's information? I dare not even call and ask about that because all districts are in a state of flux trying to wrap their calculations around the new guidance from the state, and it's it's early in the calculation period yet. Again, positively, with the capital reserve added in, the tax rate would go down 1.1%, which would reduce taxes compared to this school year, just for the Essex town tax, $11 per $100,000 of assessed value.
Now, is
So-
this something that has to be enacted by the legislature, or is this something that the education department is change?
Yes.
Both. So the yield will be determined by the legislature,
Okay.
right?
Well, this doesn't even factor in, well, let's leave
Oh, did I
yield.
skip a slide ahead?
Yeah,
I'm
no,
sorry.
let's leave
Yeah, we'll leave yield
yield
alone.
separately. Let me jump ahead on,
Okay.
on,
All right.
Yeah.
on the calculation of the per pupil cap. That's a couple slides later. This information, the next slide, I prepared for the superintendent and board chair, decided to keep that in for part of our discussion tonight. Unfortunately, my executive assistant, the superintendent, did an excellent job preparing these slides tonight, but left off the heading on the columns.
They have it
for
in their package.
these- But they're on our paper copies, both for our visitors and us, so, yes, you're right, Mark. No big
It was
deal.
that Excel to PowerPoint
Yeah,
problem.
no. So, basically what I wanted to show, I was asked if I could put some numbers to how different factors change our tax rate. So all those factors are listed in the left-hand column. So the first number column then on the left side of the page shows what we believe the Essex Town tax rate to be for FY17, with certain variables in mind, and I have those shaded in blue next to the gold-colored descriptions. That was based on a yield from the state, that $1 in base tax rate or $100 in assessed value would yield $9,955 towards the district and state education funds. Our common level of appraisal going into this budget year, last year's number, 100.52%. Equalized pupil count started out our assumptions with last year's count of 1,213, and the percent of students that were pre-K-8, 65.97. So the all of that worked out to calculating at the bottom there in the brown shaded area, $14,707 per pupil. See where I am, which was would have been $115 per student over the Vermont penalty threshold as we knew it going into this budget season. okay? And because we would have had a penalty applied, the state then would have said that our total spending was what our actual calculation was, plus the amount over added in a second time to 14,823. But that's just an initial look. So I was then asked, well, what does CLA do to all that? When you factor in the next column, we received the common level of appraisal for this new year on December 18th. That would have changed the tax rate. It increased the tax rate from 98.67 cents to $1.002. Because our common level of appraisal went down, our taxes went up. That didn't change per pupil spending or anything else, but just and that's why shaded in gold I have the new CLA. Properties are, in the state's eyes, are assessed a little bit less than what their actual selling price would be. The next revision was our equalized pupil count. That, everything else in that column is the same, but when our equalized pupil count came in so much higher than anticipated, that had the effect of lowering the tax rate. The second line down, we went to 0.9675 cents. So the
And
next,
those kids are primarily preschool kids, Roger.
correct. So then that caused a change in our spending per pupil towards the bottom of that column. Our spending per pupil then would calculate at $14,310, which was well below our penalty range from the state for our district. Next change, the next column over, is a change in the yield. Remember, originally the state told us that we could expect a tax yield of $9,955. Just a week and a half ago or so, we were told that rate would go down to $98.70. That based on updated values that the state had, they could not afford to reimburse the districts at $99.55. So because of that change on the second line, you'll see the tax rate going up a little bit from 0.96 to 0.97. With me to that point?
Yep.
So that's changes or updated information that's actually occurred. The last two columns are information that some of our representatives have heard at the state level, that there could be additional changes to the yield per base tax dollar. So the two numbers that have been discussed last week were lowering the yield first to $9,820. Second possible change was $97.33. We were told that if the state added 0.9% to everybody's spending cap, to do that, that would cost the state more money, so they would have to decrease the yield. Again, the effect of that is raising the tax rate about another penny for us. Actually, about a half a penny when you compare the first blue column to the last gold-headed column. And then last week, the School Boards Association had released that yield number of 97.33 as a possibility if spending caps were eliminated entirely.
Those
So
are
I
the
think
two
that-
scenarios that the legislature, like out of House Ed, they voted to add 0.9 unanimously. Out of the Senate Ed, they voted to eliminate the cap entirely. That impact on the state ed fund is they'll be drawing less penalty money, and consequently, it causes a reduction in the yield that impacts our tax rates. So those are numbers that somebody had testified to in terms of their impact on the yield. for each of those two scenarios, and that's based on them estimating how many districts would no longer be in the penalty box, basically collecting twice as many tax dollars for the amount over their penalty. So that was their analysis. That's where those two somewhat hypotheticals came from, educated guesses, I guess. And the drama continues because there are other things that have
Yeah.
gone on that have complicated it further since then.
I think the takeaway certainly from this slide is that this new method of computing tax rates and the state going to this new yield per $1 of base taxes, that number has not been fixed yet, and likely won't be fixed, until later in the legislative deliberations. So, not in the past, as you know, the base homestead tax rate, that was the point of fluctuation. This year, that base homestead tax rate has been set at $1 and is not fluctuating. The area of fluctuation is in the yield, and so this helps us see that as the yield changes, and it's most likely that the yield would go down rather than up, as the yield incrementally goes down, it has the effect of increasing the calculation of the tax rate a little bit.
So, Dawn, to answer your question, ultimately the legislature makes the decision, and then it's informed by the AOE in terms of when they start playing around with some of the variables. Legislators don't always know the collateral issues that come out of that, so the AOE should be at the table with them, helping inform their thinking. But I think maybe there was a disconnect this year with the AOE and legislature in terms of what this really meant, boost to the ground.
Okay.
And I think the cap came in very late in that act or bill at the very end, and I think without really the opportunity to thoroughly
It
process
was more of an add-on type
through
thing,
all
yeah.
of the, what I think they're now realizing were unintended consequences. And so frankly, in our situation, adding the 0.9 or eliminating the spending cap since we were under it to begin with becomes more costly on a tax rate basis, but it is the confusion around these caps and even how to apply them and come up with the per pupil spending limit was confused even from the folks at the AOE. They initially excluded exclusions and the intent all along had been to include them. So there had been changes, moving targets even still on our per pupil spending amount because there was an original calculation provided to Roger and all the business managers based on a misinterpretation of the law that was different from when there used to be an excess spending limit. House Ed assumed it was the same and I think did nothing to change the law. And the AOE thought, in the absence of speaking to it, I guess, that those exclusions wouldn't matter. And so now there's a second set of per pupil spending limits, which are less for all districts. But all districts get to include these exclusions.
Yep.
In our situation, it seems as though we were under the cap, we're still under the cap, we're under the cap by a little bit more.
Yep. So you've explained slides 24 through 27, so I guess we're
No,
we're
were
done.
those still
No.
coming? I'm sorry,
Yeah.
that was sort
No.
of the
Oh,
context
no.
of it. And for the purpose of the folks watching, all these slides will be on our website, www.utsd.org. There's a finance section that has all the budget information because the titles for those columns would be helpful in it's okay, Mark. But for somebody watching from home, feel free to link onto the website and pull up the presentation to follow that along, if you can even follow it then, because I don't know how Roger does this, but.
So that's the issue of of yield, our next slide just takes us back to the necessary money for our district from the state education fund, the amount that we need to draw to make our budget whole. The information to the 6-year history is shown, showing that our increase from the state education fund, the amount of money that we needed in terms of an increase averaged 1.6% for that 6-year period, which is a much lower increase than many districts faced. And again, I would say is our main reason for that was that FY11 budget when we responded so significantly to the challenges for change, and in fact asked the state education fund for $527,000 less than the previous year. FY12, we followed that up with another $227,000 reduction, and then very modest or carefully planned increases in the coming years. So, as we've already mentioned, for our base budget for FY17, we would need $17,839,872 from the state education fund, which is a 2.7% increase. Not as much this year, but in the past, that was always a critical comparison among school districts, the percentage increase in your draw from the state education fund. And if the reserve proposition is presented to voters and passed, we would need another $125,000 from the ed fund, which would be in total a 3.5% increases. See highlighted on the green line is the statewide average increases each year. So especially in FY14, that's probably the most significant info for our district, where the state average increase was 5%. Even with the capital reserve, our increase was only 4.1%, and we've been very close to the state averages in many of the years.
I think that bottom box, because that 1.96 is our allotted allowable growth increase, is important, because it would seem as though we're not going to get there with a 2.7%
Yeah.
increase or a 3 point whatever percent increase, and thus the importance of the increase in our equalized pupils. And that's when we're presenting the budget, we're presenting our per pupil spending
Right.
on the ballot this year. That was another requirement of Act 46, I think.
Yep.
So-
No, and to add to that, the 1.96% increase new this year, that's on per pupil, not on
That's right.
the total draw. So I think at this point, it would make sense to just review some of our information from the past on our equalized pupil counts. The State Agency of Education calculates the number of equalized pupils for the district each year. We've shown a history of equalized pupils going back to FY08. From FY16 to the coming year, the state's count for us is an increase of 33.6 equalized pupils, and as the superintendent recently reminded us, most of that is due to the increase in our pre-K youngsters. So prior to last Friday, it was our understanding that the district's allowable education spending for each equalized pupil would be $14,591. Allowable education spending is education fund money. So if you took the entire ed fund need and divided it by equalized pupils, if our calculation came in under 14,591, we'd be all set.
And it does.
Yes, it does.
Good, bless you.
Another little bit of historical information. the slide labeled State Education Fund, ed spending. Board looked at that information last week. You had some helpful suggestions on how to present that a little differently, and I got the correct titles assigned this week to the two categories. So I'll be anxious to hear if you find that this was an easier to understand presentation. But first of all, the money that we could collect from the education fund could increase by the factors there in number one, spending per pupil. Shown in gold is our actual spending per pupil for this current school year's budget. Multiply that times 1.96%. That's an increase of $277.14. Adding those two together equals the $14,591 that we looked at on the previous page. Multiply that times the base year, this year's number of equalized pupils, and that calculated out to $336,170 that we could increase in our draw from the education fund without penalty, assuming that our pupil count didn't change at all. Secondly, though, we know, and we've just looked at the fact that our equalized pupil count increased. So if you calculate the increase in equalized pupils, 33.6, and multiply that times the 14,591 15, that should be 46, I'm sorry, per pupil, that shows an allowable increase in educational spending just based on the increase in equalized pupils. As we've discussed in the past, we knew that our budget, even with capital reserve, was still coming in far less than the state would have allowed us to increase our need for money from the state.
Nicely done on that slide.
Okay,
Excellent.
thank you.
Easier to understand.
Crystal clear.
So, the, thanks for the clarity on that last slide will soon fade as you look at the next slide. But this is what I've been dealing with the past day here as we've, actually the board chair and I were emailing back and forth till 8 or 9 o'clock Friday night about this issue. I don't think we need to look at the historical columns. That's for your reference later on, but FY 13, 14, 15, and even, let's look at the column labeled FY 16. We know that this year we had 1,213 equalized pupils in our district. 625.7 equalized pupils at the high school. Our district's gross spending per pupil, which is the number that we used to calculate allowable growth in per pupil expense on the previous page, was 14,314. To calculate that, you divide this year's ed fund draw by 1,213 pupils. Vermont's penalty threshold for FY 16 was $17,103. If we stayed under that, we would not incur a tax penalty for our spending per pupil. We were $2,789 below that, so we were good to go. The net spending per pupil, and I'll talk a little bit further about gross and net in a minute, but the net spending per pupil for this current school year was $14,139.64. I have a slide in a few moments that will show that a little more directly, but the difference between gross and net, gross spending is, again, dividing education fund draw by the number of equalized pupils. The net spending per pupil allows a couple deductions. One, and that's on a per pupil basis. Part is for some credit on special education expenses. If any one student's expenses were over $50,000, we get a credit per pupil back on that. And also, some of our capital debt is eligible for a per pupil credit. And so, deducting for this current year those two areas of credit, it reduced our net spending to about $180 or so less than the gross spending. Really a technicality, and quite frankly, the state was never clear. I always showed the board our net spending compared to the state average, because that's how I understood the comparison to be, but based on the past day or two and some of the confusion, I'm not sure that that is a completely accurate statement going forward.
And I think what I understand of it, Roger, at least since they had the old version of excess spending limits, I do think you're right that the assumption has always been it's been net, but for some reason, the AOE misinterpreted or assumed that those old assumptions were out with this imposition of the allowable growth in Act 46, and provided these initial limits based on gross numbers. And so I don't think you're wrong. I think we've been doing it right. I think somehow their assumption dropped back to as though the old excess spending calculation didn't ever exist, where the House Ed folks, when they crafted the bill, had assumed it would be based on the same calculation method used with the previous excess spending. That's when that problem was recognized. That's been the especially challenging chatter over the last several days to reconcile this, and this is why they have provided a second set of numbers that are based on the net. And I guess for some districts that's beneficial, for others less so, and for everybody confusing. And it's making it, I think, impossible for them to figure out how to resolve this problem in the legislature and come to a decision on what they do about it. So that's the color commentary on our challenges.
So now to perhaps make it a little more clear why I was so liberal with my use of colors on this chart. So go back to the FY16 column. Gross spending per pupil, 14,300.
Yeah.
Draw an arrow from that to the red box below and to the right. If you multiply 14,314 by, or increase it by 1.196%, that equals the 14,591, which we thought was to be our per pupil penalty threshold, that we shouldn't go over that. Instead, if you take the second gold number, 14,139, increase that by the same percentage and go down a block, that comes up with the revised penalty number that we got Friday morning of $14,416.78. So let's go back to the top of the FY17 column. The number of equalized pupils we're talking about hasn't changed. The gross spending per pupil, 14,310.82, that's just what I told you it was going to be a week ago. And we were $280 under the penalty. See where we are? Now if we say that the net spending per equalized pupil, the new threshold is, our spending, our net spending per equalized pupil in the green, 14,160, and compare that to our penalty threshold of 14,416, we're now $256.76 below this new penalty, where before we were $280 below the other penalty. So no big change for us, and the same pattern holds true if you factor in a capital reserve. So
either way, we're just under by a little
Right.
less. Our margin of
Right.
error is a little less.
yes,
With the new calculation.
yes.
As you might imagine, for those that were really targeting and making their cuts based on the initial information, and I'm sure that maybe there's some scenarios where what they could exclude was so big that it made it more favorable to get a new set of numbers, but everybody's numbers went down. And so if you were on the razor's edge and cutting it as little as you could to remain within the cap, it is likely that you may have then found yourself above the cap. And so, and that literally, this information, I think, Roger got late on Friday. I
Yes.
saw come through on Friday, just in my VSBA role, with updates from those folks.
The AOE, about 6 or 7 o'clock Friday night, sent out the information that's shown on the next slide. That's their suggestion on how they were showing districts the difference. So the middle column there marked initial based on total spending per pupil. We know that our total spending FY16 was 14,314 and proposed for next year 14,411. Okay, same numbers, nothing's changed. Originally, there was no exclusion for this per pupil debt or per pupil special ed expense, so there was no, the state wasn't calculating our net per pupil amount at all. The allowable growth was calculated for us at $277 a student, so that added up. The two items in blue, 14,300 and 277, equal 14,591. We were $180 below the threshold. Same numbers as the previous page, and all that that then calculated to a per pupil tax for, or per pupil spending for tax purposes of 14,411, and our estimated tax rate of 98 cents. With me there?
Yep.
Now in the revised column, the 14.3 and 14.4, that didn't change. You see what our exclusions are for our credits for that one portion of our capital debt and the special ed amount per pupil. For some districts, if there was a big change from year to year in those numbers, much higher or much lower, that caused problems for them. In our case, the numbers didn't really change. I know, I calculate the amount of exclusion for debt each year, and my number always is spot on with what the state later says it should be. The SPED exclusion, because the state didn't believe that that was going to be a factor this year, we didn't get that number till, again, about 7 or 8 o'clock Friday night. So, and I had no way of calculating that credit for FY17. I already knew what it was for FY16. So
These
if you
numbers, Roger, the both exclusions, less debt and less sped, are from the state. Those are state numbers that have been corroborated by you.
FY16 is, the state and I both arrived at the same calculations.
But the 147.90, that's the number that you've calculated.
I've calculated, the state hasn't told us their
Yeah,
calculation
yeah,
of it yet,
yeah,
but
yeah.
it will be the same.
Yeah.
And,
The SPED number?
great.
It is now.
And
Why don't you send the state though?
Yeah.
I was just
Well-
gonna say, if they don't come back the same, Roger, I'm gonna
Yeah.
ask that you make them double
Yeah.
check their math.
Well, when they ask for our preliminary budget after the board finalizes the budget before the end of January, then I have to send them a preliminary budget, and I tell them what our total excludable debt is, so they simply accept that number. I don't know if they have something to corroborate it in the state, but then they divide it by equalized pupils, so it's not a surprise when it comes back the same. But, so that's how you go from total spending per pupil versus net spending with those two credits. So, and then as I mentioned, the per pupil threshold is going down in this new scenario. So we're 156 below the threshold. It has the effect, so I believe, of actually lowering our tax rate. So for us, the change in threshold was not a problem at all, and it has the positive effect of lowering our tax rate a penny.
That's if the yield doesn't change, but
Well,
the
Yeah.
yield will change.
the yield will change.
Based on the change in the caps, depending on how many then are going to be in violation of it. It's such a circular thing, because the first thing I asked of Nicole Mace when we got the information was, okay, what will then the impact be on the yield? Because this tax rate impact for our voters is not something that we can target with certainty. We can provide our best estimate based on the most current information at the time we print either our summary sheet or do whatever. I think we feel comfortable in the budget we're putting forth based on the priorities and the needs of students and the community. But we used to fret that base funding number, which then would be set in May, and we'd
Right.
be told in December what it to be projecting based on. And that often defined that year where the tax rate was so much higher. That was almost in its entirety, less than 2% of that was anything we could impact. Like 7% of it was from the state, if I remember correctly, that year. But a lot of times we get all through our budgets and they find that the overall increases were less, and then they change that number again. So now instead of changing that base amount, it's the yield that's the moving target. I don't know why it feels more frustrating this year, but probably because of the lack of clarity around this cap thing.
Yeah, I think we don't know what's
It's just
happening.
a different number that's variable, but
Certainly, it's the first year out of the box with a new methodology,
Yeah.
and so there was, there's been a bit of learning curve on my part, and I'm sure my colleagues in other districts, but we've seen that there's been a bit of a experience curve here in the AOE and in the legislature, and all getting on the
It feels
same
like usually we're struggling to understand a number that's set. Now we're trying to struggle to understand a number that isn't even
Yeah.
set.
right.
So
Set a
it's
different
like-
number. They set a different,
It's like,
yeah.
so no matter how hard we struggle to get it, it's still, we don't know that that's what it is. And then, so my quick question for you, at one point, we were all cheering, going, yay, our tax rate, instead of decreasing 0.76, is now decreasing 1.81 because of these great exclusions. Then the next slide, we said, well, but it actually might only be decreasing 0.26, or actually even going up 0.65 based on the yield.
Yeah.
Is that 0.26 decrease or 0.65 increase based on the new calculations using these exclusions?
What you just said was it was in the reverse order of what we did it.
Okay.
We discussed it. We first looked at the effect that a changing yield could have on tax rates, but the yield has not been set.
Right.
But then assuming the yield as we know it today, which is 98.60, and these changes in how you look at per pupil spending and whether it's gross or net with the inclusion of exclusions, that's what changed the tax rates. The tax rates will change further if the yield changes further, but the tax information that you're seeing tonight is based on the yield number that the state last told us to use, which was 98.60.
And those that were estimated for the two scenarios under consideration in the House and the Senate right now, and hopefully being voted on by the full body tomorrow, one or more of these, who knows if there's a third one today. But those were based on projections of what the yield would be, based on the fact that fewer districts would be in penalty phase, yielding fewer districts paying $2 for every $1 back to them. And so, to the extent anything is reducing the money going back to the state, there's likely to have some impact on the yield. Those were just numbers that I think the AOE or somebody had calculated in testimony to those two committees to indicate the impact of those two scenarios that had been voted on and passed out of those committees.
But and those numbers, though, were before this whole issue over how to calculate spending per pupil or which method to
Yeah.
use.
I will say the
Came
most recent thing in the Vermont Digger that Dave Sharp, who's the chair of the House Ed Committee, is talking or had spoken about, it was at the end of the most recent Digger article, was a consideration that the House, which passed unanimously, the adding 0.9 to every cap is suggesting that perhaps you add the 0.9 and then districts would be held harmless to choose whichever calculation methodology they wanted. So we could choose whichever was more favorable, or for us, it won't matter because we're not in penalty phase under either scenario, but districts who thought they were not under penalty phase with the budgets they had passed can use those old calculations where you get the higher amount but you don't get the exclusion, or the net amount. So the last thing he said, and I haven't heard anything today, but the last thing the digger reported was that there's consideration for doing the 0.9 increase and holding districts harmless to choose whichever method, calculation and cap is going to be, more favorable for them.
So yet another variable.
Exactly. And so expecting information on the yield before, I don't know, April or May, who knows, right? I don't know. But I would suspect they're clear that if they don't do something, tomorrow or soon, those who are voting on town meeting day will have missed their warning, and all these districts have been doing their budgets, and most of them are done with them if they're voting town meeting day. So I don't really know. There is a strong push, given all this confusion, for repeal, because while the intent was to curb costs and to bring costs in line, there are so many challenges to this out there, including even legal challenge to its constitutionality. But I had also heard in color commentary that Act 46 probably wouldn't have passed without some sort of cost containment in it, and that's where they came to the caps that were variable based on current spending.
So if I could offer just a couple summary comments. Again, we're in the enviable position that we don't need to have any money added to, or any percentage added to caps, and we don't need to have caps eliminated. We're in good shape however you look at it, and actually it helps our tax rate if these things don't change too much. But I think, just to remind the board, as you well know, each year at this time when we present a budget, I believe we make it, or attempt to make it very clear to voters that the information that we're showing on taxes for their current year, that is what it is. But what we're projecting for the next year is our best estimates based on factors that aren't always finalized at the time we're going to press. Now, we don't go to press till into March, and I'm sure if more clarity or more definition came out on these issues during the month of February, even though our budget number is set, we would make our publication reflect the most recent tax calculation-related information. But still, it's very likely that all these issues won't be entirely resolved by the time folks vote on our budget, or if nothing else, finalized just after we've printed and sent out our materials. So
It's certainly not
but-
going to be finalized by the time we vote on it.
Right.
Which is
I mean,
presumably next week.
it's possible, if they're gonna do anything of substance and it's supposed to happen tomorrow or the next day, we might have enough information on Monday to have a better idea of what they went with, but what that means for yield or anything else, we probably wouldn't, but we might have more clarity. And I'm gonna segue us, because I know our next slide is around capital reserve. I think we're clear that the base operating budget is what it is, and I think you guys had the opportunity to hear last week, and I was caught up on it, the capital improvements sort of list, and the purpose of capital reserve is an important strategy in planning for the future and the health and well-being of our buildings and our capital pieces of this. So I'm going to segue and ask Roger to share that with those who had not seen it before.
Should we just ask if there's any questions, though, on
Revenue,
the
definitely, you go ahead.
revenue and ed fund and everything? Nope, all set?
Yeah.
So what you're gonna see tonight is we've just done some prioritizing, so this is the same.
It's the same list. The number is slightly different, though, because if you compare tonight's slide to last week's, I think the number that I had for replacing the founder's windows was 200,000.
Yeah.
And the total of those prioritized items added up to more than what we have in reserve already, and the number you were talking about reserving. But we got so far last week that I thought it might make sense to call the architect and ask for a real number than my guesstimate. And so his real number was lower. I was pleasantly surprised, so we were able to make it that the items that we see as priority improvements add up to the amount currently in reserve and the proposed reserve allocation if that's approved for next year.
I love the way that works. It
That
all
is-
adds up.
Yes.
Good
Occasionally,
math.
things do add up, right? Occasionally,
Well, that's a nice surprise.
yes.
I was gonna say, what windows aren't you replacing?
These interior
First
ones.
floor instead of the.
Right, that's great.
Actually, just to explain too, so it doesn't appear that we're fickle on these numbers, you realize that whenever you ask for estimates for any work, you know, depending on the amount of engineering, there's always a bill, understandably so, and reflective of the architect or engineer's time and so forth. So to ask for numbers on more exacting numbers on a lot of things that we're probably not gonna be able to afford to get to, it's not money well spent now. If we do something in 5 years from now, the cost is gonna change and they'll need to rework everything anyways.
So, for the purposes of folks, again, seeing this for the first time, the list of prioritized improvements are those that we would be intending to ask for support in the capital reserve article. And then we have a lineup of these things that will match those expenses. So when we would unify, and we've spoken with our neighbors in CCSU to understand that the intent is that each of these capital reserves are being spent in advance of the unification. Is
Correct,
that the
correct.
understanding?
And I think also an important point for folks who haven't poured over these numbers over and over again, we currently have, is it 126,000?
Yes.
In our capital reserve. So we're not looking to ask for 251, we're looking to ask for 125.
Right.
That's the number that
Yep.
we've been throwing around.
The reserve that voters approved for, the allocation to our capital reserve that voters approved for this year, we have not spent that. We don't have plans to spend it during this year. It's clearly being held in reserve. The balance of the reserve at the end of last fiscal year in June was $1,203 because during the lifetime of our reserve, we've spent about $475,000 on necessary upgrades to our buildings. So take last year's balance, add in this year's allocation, and some slight interest earnings for this year in that reserve fund, and thus we estimate that the balance of the reserve at the end of this June will be $126,250. Add another $125 next year if so resolved and approved, would be the balance of $251,000.
So Kimberly, maybe if you could please just advance it to the next slide, and that summarizes what Roger just stated.
Does anybody else have any questions on the list? Yes.
I was just wondering, in terms of, I see you have some that are like highest priority versus other identified needs. Is there a specific way that you determine that, or is it kind of the consensus of the board that determines the priority level of the project?
I think, so we take our advice on these issues in particular, of course, from Roger, who takes them from our facilities manager.
Correct.
Who does, very regular checks on the status of our assets, our buildings, our facilities, our grounds? And that's a great question. So
Certainly, all the items on our list, we believe are important, and in a perfect world, we'd have the funding to do the entire list and be done with it. Instead, though, we prudently do things in some installments, and again, as Kim said, our maintenance director in large part advises us what he sees as the most important issues. Certainly, the last couple items related to building security. You know, we did a lot of security upgrades a couple years ago, and this would be the final things that came out as being things we needed to include. The ventilation of the early ed wing at the elementary school. That's our oldest part of any of our buildings, and a fairly simple fix, though, given its small area. Again, the 35,000 for additional speakers to separate the public address system from classroom telephones. That also relates to security. I think the need for hoods in the kitchen sort of speaks for it itself, and the founder's windows are definitely our draftiest window problem.
But just to be clear, there's money in the operating budget for building enhancements. I don't know if you want to, Kim, define sort of the difference between capital improvement and what you typically would do just in the course of a yearly maintenance schedule, painting, just general sort of upkeep.
Right.
I'm sorry, I guess I was just more, like, I was gonna, you have $200,000 to enlarge the FMS parent parking lot. And I just was kind of wondering, in terms of that being an identified priority, I've almost been hit waiting, are people who kind of fly on the grass and don't pay attention, and I have young kids, and it's just, it seems like last year it wasn't as dangerous maybe as it is this year, and I just was wondering kind of how you.
Yeah.
I think some of these are the things in that category where we, in an ideal world, we would love to do that, and the engineering to consider how to expand that parking. And then the other lot, which serves both buildings, is a much bigger project that would involve Founders Road and a lot of, or, I don't even know the full extent of what that might be, but I similarly, I think that rightly Roger has helped us identify those things that are going to be most important to do more quickly, and those that are part of a bigger, longer plan. One of the questions I have somewhat in that vein, Roger, are any of these that are on this lower list, despite the fact that additional $1.68 million is not available, as one who will serve on the new board in the unified district, are there things on that list that we're thinking are imminently in need of replacement for 2018 or 2019, like, where we got stuff shoved up there to stop up holes or something that we're not going to be prepared to handle as a new board immediately?
No, good question. No, they're not imminently necessary. The roof on the elementary pods is original to that addition, and we've had our roofer out a couple times looking at it, and he says, yeah, it's going to need to be done at some point, but he really can't find anything wrong with it now, and so we would hear a good couple years in advance of it really being at a failure point. The elevator is finicky, but it's not going to stop working. A new elevator would be nice. We're always doing a little bit of roadway repaving or something, but no, we don't see anything breaking real soon. the boilers at the elementary school, again, are old, but they're working fine, and we don't have any issues with them. So our maintenance director thinks that they should be on the list, but
So what has the maintenance director done a projected chart as to when the optimal replacement would be for these items? I mean, because you're just giving me a generic list.
right.
But I'm not seeing a estimated time for replacement chart on this. This is just a nice laundry list, but it's, you know, you've got the prioritization at the top of the sheet. But when does it wear out? Okay, sort of a thing. It's kind of, I don't see replacing computers, I don't see replacement of carpets, you know, things that some things would be in maintenance, yes, because you know, yearly or they're less than 5-year turnaround. Some of these, yes, the boiler's probably a 20, 30-year item if you're absolutely lucky. Some people replace them every 15 years. So it's kind of like, where's the, I guess, you know, coming in is where's the estimation for, because it's going to be a melding of all kinds of things. And I guess it'd be nice for your taxpayers to see when this estimate's going to happen. Because right now you'd know, okay, and it'd be nice to know what on the list you might be able to knock off. The safety issues, as this one lady nice talks about, yeah, hitting kids with cars is not a great thing.
Does not fit our end goal.
No, it's anti-mission. So, but, you know, getting back to a more serious thing, I mean, it would be nice to see a estimate chart, okay? Because all of us, you know, come on, you get somebody in, you have to look on the roof, and they'll say, yeah, you got a 15-year roof, you got maybe a couple more years on it, you know, so you might make it to 17, you know. So it's,
I think we could do the finer detail. I think we don't have that tonight, but I think we have a pretty good idea what rooms need to be played, what carpets need to come up. We have a 5-year tech plan that lays out in very great detail our replacement strategies. So we have companion documents that I think we could produce. It's a really good point, but this list here, I can't really speak to these bigger capital improvement projects, but sort of the finer detail year to year of the things that have to happen, that is spelled out. Yeah.
well,
I would say too,
Not-
the
not in this-
technology plan is handled under the technology budget, so that wouldn't be included, sorry, in the capital plan. But, so, no, understood.
It's just that, you know, when you
Well, I imagine we're gonna get to ask these guys for that on the new board, because I think we're gonna have to know as we craft the new
There's
budget.
lots of facilities. I mean, there's
Right.
gonna be in the order of somewhere around 20 buildings.
Right.
You know, and that doesn't even talk about the personnel, okay, that go into them. So it's, yeah, we're tripling,
And I
okay,
think
the size of your
the,
district.
The conversation that Roger and I think Grant were able to have was to get a better understanding of where each of their budgets stood with respect to their plans around capital improvements, and not wanting to have one community asking for, I think the high school manages and does their capital reserve requests differently than we do. We do a straight up dollar amount. They do up to 1% of the budget. And so historically, that's the way they've asked for it in their article, as I recall it. And I think their current capital reserve balance is somewhere in the 40,000 range. It's relatively low, or maybe it might even be, I'm not sure, it might be somewhat less than that. Where I think the capital reserve balance in the Prudential Committee is something in the order of 600,000. So the understanding that Roger and Grant had as they spoke preliminarily earlier was that each of our current district boards and budgets would ask for the capital reserve that aligned with what the anticipated needs were for the current year, with the ability to look forward at least a couple of years, that we're not handing off something that's going down on a new board immediately.
Right.
And
But-
so I know that that was also prior to the caps and not entirely prior to the caps, but prior to the mobility on these caps that have been going on. And I know that those budgets were tighter to the caps than ours were, so that their planning around that may have changed. when we brought in the capital reserve fund a number of years ago, it was on the thought that these bigger capital improvements don't happen year over year, so they don't really belong in an operating budget. Just like we would each plan for the replacement of our own roofs, we would do so in saving over a number of years. And our community has embraced the notion of a capital reserve article, almost, we've had tremendous support for our budgets in general, but if we pull that article out separate from the operating budget, it's passed by, marginally higher than the full operating budget. So we understand, the community seems to understand the value of the capital reserve. I totally get where you're coming from, because it's where my question was coming from. Okay, of the next round of stuff, is any of it year one or year two for a new unified district? I'm hoping those are the conversations that will be happening, in all of the local budgets. The part that we can control and anticipate is what we're trying to do with what we're reasonably asking of our community before we hand this over, is to take the support we have now and the current balance and what we're asking for, and align it with what we anticipate in the next year or two and get it done now.
I understand
While it's within our control to do that.
I understand that. I guess I'm reflecting on the lady who's here in the audience with me's question, is the prioritization of this massive list
Yeah.
of worthy projects. It's what's the priority of, okay? And it's, I know that the education component here, from my past interactions with this district, the education component's always come on the forefront, so is security. And so, to hear that, and that it's kind of like, I guess I get a warm, comfy feeling if I knew that, if the operating budget allowed that, some capabilities of making the exterior environment walking car friendly, sort of an environment out there, because it sounds like it's becoming challenging, as to getting that more in tune with our thoughts than where it is currently.
I'm wondering too if, aside from major engineering overhaul, maybe, that is signage. And because there's certainly, there's parking spots and there's places for people to drive and there's sidewalk. So the capacity for it being safe is there. The individual behavior of folks behind a wheel is, maybe there are things that we can improve that are not a complete engineering redesign that speak to that, because the space we have, I think, is the space we have in terms of the confines of a current budget, and even thinking about any major redesign as we are unifying. I think probably looking at all facilities on a unified
Understood.
board would be important.
Right now, because
Mhm.
I don't come here on a regular basis. I'm sure that's going to change. However, okay, some of the sidewalks do look like walking paths or maintenance jitney paths that I've seen used for golf carts and that sort of thing. And in the dark, you could mistake a sidewalk for a one-lane street. So if you're not familiar with what it looks like in the daylight. So and there isn't a whole lot of snow out there to guide me as to where normally at this point in time we'd have a few inches, other than the dusting that we just got. So those would tell me directly and say, oh yeah, it's snow, I can't drive on that. So I guess I'm looking at that input. I guess I'm giving you that input. I think that if you've got a security, safety issue dealing with pedestrians, I think maybe you need to address that and give it a higher priority than something that might wait. If and I'm not seeing a weighted priority here, so.
I trust that the 250 list is a weighted priority, and I think what we might be able to get a little more information on that isn't necessarily impactful on this budget, things like that we can do, signage or otherwise, to encourage the safe use of the current passages, is, I think, something we can figure out how we do that. The timeline around these other things, I'm sure that that's also something Roger at some point can give us in the not-too-distant future. I don't think it's going to change the amount that we'll ask for in capital reserve. And if something were to pop, like all of a sudden our boiler goes down, one of the other things that weren't imminent probably doesn't get done. But in looking at the timeline and prioritize needs, in using the resources that we currently have, the 126 that we currently have and the 125 we're asking for, this was a list that aligned with that. But I will, if not before, and it sounds as though it wouldn't be terribly taxing to put together somewhat of a
No,
timelined list.
we've done
and
that
estimate.
before. We haven't looked at it
Yeah.
in this budget season, but
Yeah.
we have that. And yeah, there's 4
And I
or
know
5
that we'll
items
ask for
on
it as
that,
a new board,
on that
for
other
sure.
list that we know should be done within X number of years. Some of the others, if funding is available and they're done, fine. If because we haven't been able to make funding available, there's things on that list that we've lived with a long time and we continue to live with. Actually, the one that we're discussing at such length here, the sidewalks and parking lots and so forth on this campus, our architect could speak in far more detail to all the regulations and requirements, but part of the reason we've studied that and spent a few dollars to have the engineer make recommendations and draw plans and so forth. But on this campus, we are at the limit of paved surfaces that we can have without doing major stormwater revisions to our parking lots. That it becomes exorbitantly pricey. So that's one reason that we keep that on our list, because we know it's something that would make sense, but it is not easy to accomplish. So.
But your feedback's important, because when we think about our annual report and putting more specificity in our report to inform, citizens around, here are the priorities, here's how we make decisions, and here are sort of some general timelines, I think so thanks for the feedback. Yeah.
And Kim, it also might be interesting, I'm not sure how to put this into policy and request, but if it's something that is coming up, safety issues, obviously that's a significant concern for us, and I don't know how many of us have founders kids. You're the one driving through the founders program.
Casual.
Oh, both, okay.
I usually go to EMS, and I don't even bother driving to the Founders
So,
Walk,
we're,
quite honestly.
we're a little less,
But yeah.
some of us are a little less familiar with that as our kids have gotten older. That may be something worth the board asking, what are some ideas for signage, speed bump? I don't know, I'm just throwing around, I'm just pulling things out of my head at the moment.
And we've had those, and we can show you, we've had engineers come in, we have some plans that have been scoped out, but it is prohibitively expensive, and only so much you can do.
I point out that I have seen a lot of signage, and I know that Wendy and everyone here has made a lot of efforts to try and make that parking lot safer, and I think a large part of the problem is people picking up who may be in a hurry, or who may not be thinking about people who have their 2-year-olds with them, or whatever. So they, you had the wooden stakes at one point on the grass
Yeah.
along the fence, and I mean,
People mow
I
them
saw at
over.
least 3 times where people pulled right in there and took the stakes out, and, kids cutting across to try and go to get to the sidewalk to go home, who aren't always making the best decisions either, get right in that kind of crossway. And I don't know that there is, people are people.
Yeah, I appreciate though hearing about it, because again, we're not, Dan and I at least are not picking, nor is John, picking up here. And I'm not surprised that Wendy's making efforts in trying to help that situation, and bearing it in mind, we can think about what other ways to try and reach parents and remind them of the importance of safety in that very busy time of day for all families. So thank you very much for sharing.
Just
And I love the
brainstorming other
idea. Yeah.
there might be an opportunity to brainstorm other ideas,
Yeah.
and people might have a suggestion.
Or maybe even if Wendy does it in her principal's letter or something, suggestions. This is the problem, folks. What are the suggestions, kind of thing. This is what we've done. What else would help remind folks about safety at that time of day? Those are great ideas, and I'm sure Wendy's open to that. And thank you, Mark, because I think the specificity around timeline while I'm sort of thinking about it in the new board hat, is going to be really helpful even for our folks that read the annual report in its entirety to have an idea and to just be explicit in the fact that you've already looked at these and this is what you're anticipating.
Good.
Knowing that we're handing things over to a unified district in good shape with those needs that we could anticipate in the next couple of years being handled by the current reserves that are within our control to allocate. So, thank you very much. Any other questions for Roger or Mark or any of us, or any questions for these guys? No, thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you, RETN, for being here. I want to apologize for not having acknowledged Martin Luther King Day when we got here. I think I will share with you an education-related Martin Luther King quote because it is apt for the purposes of all these investments that we're asking and the support we're asking of our community. The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. So thank you all for the commitment to what you've done to craft a budget that really prioritizes this for our kids and honors the investment of our taxpayers. Thank you guys for being here.
2 hours.
2 hours, I know.
Yeah.
We will take this up for vote. This was, I think, our final budget info session, and we will be taking this up as a vote for what we will put forth to the voters on Monday, the 25th. Feel free to come back and join us. It will be a less lengthy presentation. If something were to change dramatically over the next week, we may have more information to share or consider regarding capital reserve, but I think otherwise that seems like we got what we got.
Yep. I'd like to just mention too, for the board, when we bring this back next week, remember that this year, for the first time now, our resolutions that we put forward to the public will include information on per pupil spending as required under the latest legislation.
And I'm hoping they give you like language of what that article's
On
supposed
the,
to.
Yep.
on the warning itself.
Awesome, yeah, right on the
Kim,
line.
I guess we didn't really discuss, other than in 3.0, we're talking about proposing the 125 capital reserve. Do we need to do anything more official than that before next week?
Do we, I think that's an important question to ask, Dan. Do we, I know that you guys had discussed it last week, and I know that that nicely lines up with the list of priorities Roger has shared with us in terms of our balance when all is said and done. So does anybody feel the need or want to see anything different than the request for 125?
My one thought on that was, not to be flippant overly quick, but our thought was, wow, look, our taxes are going down.
Mm-hmm.
If we do the 125, they still go down a very tiny bit, but they still go down.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of that is thrown into question, and that's kind of where some of my questions were coming from. Are we going down? Are we going up? Do we know? Because it was kind of a no-brainer when our taxes were going down and we could continue to fund our,
Right.
our reserve. That was, we all kind of breathed a sigh of relief and went, wow, that's really cool. I don't know if that affects anybody's thoughts on, oh, well, this is going to cause our taxes to go up by, a marginal amount. If that affects our feelings about the, our about the reserve, because our conversation about the reserve last week was informed by what turned out to be
Close
a
to.
curveball.
we were okay as long as the tax rate went down and we could still have the reserve, but if the reserve is gonna eliminate the decrease in taxes, it's.
Last, your
question.
slide on comparison of FY17 tax rates addresses that issue. Last week, with the reserve, we believed that estimated that taxes would go down 0.07%, 7/100th of a percent. Tonight, the information presented is that with the reserve, taxes would go down much more than that, 1.1%. So rather than going down 70 cents per thousand, as we thought last week, which was just a little bit, tonight we project that they would go down $11 per $100,000 of assessed value.
But that doesn't take into account
Any
this
change
yield
in the
question.
Yeah,
yield.
but
So-
the yield doesn't change, the scenarios that I gave you on yield shows that it's not gonna change that dramatically, I don't believe.
Okay.
And, I think that's where I was suggesting, if there were to be a dramatic change in information around things like the yield or what the legislature's doing and its impact, because at least in our situation, applying the new net calculation, not any of the scenarios being considered and not any yield implications, but applying it with the net per pupil amount is advantageous to us from a
Correct.
current tax
Yes.
expectation. We're not going to have certainty around the impact on the yield. My suspicion would be, though, because they did some sort of an estimate to come up with what those two scenarios would cost. If they have resolution on Tuesday or Wednesday of this week, my guess is somebody's going to put together some sort of analysis of its potential impact. So if they say you definitely have to use gross method or you definitely have to use net method, you're going to, and you 0.9, it's now the new yield is expected to be. I'm hopeful that whatever should come out and be decided this week would come with an estimate of its impact on the yield, which then is easy enough for Roger to, or whomever.
And you won't approve till Monday night, and there'd be a separate motion to approve the
Right.
the
Right.
reserve.
The
So
reserve.
you'll see two scenarios like we.
Yeah, and
Yeah, there'll be
being
5 work
sensitive.
days before you
Yeah.
approve next
Yeah,
Monday
that's right.
evening, or resolve next Monday evening, so.
And so I think being sensitive to that, if there were a dramatic change that all of a sudden this caused a 1% or a 2% increase in our tax rate, to ask for the yield, the capital reserve. If anything happens to that extent, Roger and Mark, please bring us some variables on that 125
Yeah.
that, might be less, and what then would come off of that priority list to be able to accommodate that. Because I feel comfortable if it's such a marginal change with the list provided, lining up with the balances we would have, that those are thoughtful decisions. But if all of a sudden it's going to be a tax increase will feel like that, like an increase to our taxpayers, I think we need to consider some options and what would go off that list.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. Anything else, you guys? All right, thank you all.
Madam Chair, I make the motion that we adjourn.
Thank you. A second.
I will second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Passes 5-0. Thank you very much.